Kilo 2, Echo Juliet Tango. Roger, Roger. I've got you a 5-5 in New York. Thank you for the activation. Good luck in 7-3. So what you're hearing is me talking to a park in Wisconsin. He's at Settle State Wildlife Area in Wisconsin, and I am in New York. Now, the bands are not in great condition today, but that is the power of HF radio. No infrastructure, nothing but my radio and my antenna on my end, and his radio and his antenna and his end, and I was just able to talk to this guy in Wisconsin. Depending on the band we're on, depending on the time of day and various other factors and what the conditions are like, you can talk all over the world with HF radio. So what we're going to do today is we are going to talk a little bit about HF radio for emergency preparedness. Now, we've been talking about VHF, UHF, so line of sight communications, which is great for close in, like neighbor to neighbor or within your city kind of communications. But what if you want to get out further than that? So with HF or high frequency radio, which is kind of a misnomer because these frequencies are very low. You can see I'm at 18.146. So that's 18 megahertz. We were talking like 144 or 440 megahertz with UHF and VHF. But with HF radio, we can get ranges that are unheard of on UHF and VHF radio. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to hop into the computer and I'm going to talk a little bit about things like wavelengths and bands and propagation. There's a lot to HF radio. This is a lot more complicated than UHF and VHF stuff is. Now, I don't want to scare you. I don't want to make it overly complicated, but I do want you to have an understanding of what some of these things entail and understand that this is not as simple as picking up a handheld radio, keying up and talking on a repeater. There's a lot more that goes into this. All right. So we're going to hop over to the computer and we're going to take a look at some things that you need to know. Today, we're specifically going to be talking about things like bands, band conditions, and propagation. If you've watched any of my previous videos where I've been screen recording, I've had issues with sound only on one channel. I think I've got that solved. So hopefully when we hop over here to the computer, that will be a non-issue. All right, and this is who I just talked to. Okay, so if I click on him, that's Jesse. He lives in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. Okay, he's currently in Wisconsin. If I click on this, so this is the park he's currently at. All right, I can show you how far away that is from where I am, just to give you an idea. I am way over here, and he is way over here. All right, that's the power of HF radio. So like I said, what we're going to do is we're going to hop into the computer here. We're going to take a look at some of the different things that you need to consider before you get on the radio on HF, so that you kind of understand how propagation works, because it's not as simple as, like I said, just keying up the radio and talking. So let me switch over to the computer, and I'll be back in just a second. I'll try to hash through some of this stuff in a way that makes it make sense. So I'll be back in just a minute. Okay, so we're back at the computer. This should look really familiar because we looked at this in my UHF VHF video. This is a PDF of the U.S. amateur radio bands. This is on the ARRL website. So we need to talk a little bit about frequencies and wavelengths and bands. Like I said, we did that before a little bit, but this is going to be a little bit more complicated. So on the HF side, or the high frequency side of radio, we start at 10 meters. So that's this guy right here, which is about 28 megahertz. And we go all the way up to 2200 meters or 135 kilohertz. Understand that these top two bands, 220 meters and 630 meters, 2200 and 630, basically no one is going to use. These are not going to be used for anything that you would ever use for emergency radio. For all intents and purposes, they may as well not exist. All right. You need special permission to even be able to use them. There are power restrictions and all sorts of other crazy things on those. Now, between 160 meters and 10 meters, this is where our bread and butter is going to be. Now, let's talk a little bit about the bands themselves. Uh, so when you look at this number, so 160 meters or 80 meters or 60 meters or so on and so forth, that is the length of a single wavelength of the frequency. Okay, so one oscillation is that long. Okay, so for instance, a 40-meter band, all right, that's about 132 feet, depending on the frequency, is one wavelength. So that's a pretty long wavelength, right? 160 meters is obviously much longer than that. We get down low to, let's say, 10 meters. You're talking 30, 39 feet, maybe something in that general vicinity for a wavelength. Again, that's pretty long, but comparatively speaking, compared to like 160, which is massive, it's fairly short. Understand that the shorter the distance in the wavelength, the higher the frequency. All right, so frequency is how often that wavelength oscillates. Okay, so for instance, this is 28 megahertz. Okay, so this oscillates 28 megahertz. All right, this one oscillates at, let's say, 1.8 megahertz, or this one's 3.5 megahertz. So hertz is just a measurement of frequency. So, you're talking thousands or millions of cycles per second, depending on the frequency we're talking about. So this is happening extremely fast. All right. So there are all of these different bands, and you would use different bands for different things at different times. Now, let's talk kind of a little bit about what each of these bands might be used for. So we'll start with the most common bands that you're going to see people use, which would be the 20-meter band and the 40-meter band. Those are kind of your two most common bands you're going to see most people use. So those bands are going to be useful for different things at different times of day. So the 20-meter band, this guy right here, 14 megahertz, that is generally speaking, a long distance band. Now, when I say long distance, it could be anywhere between 600 or 700 miles and the other side of the planet, depending on what propagation is like. We'll talk about propagation in a little bit because that's a little bit complicated. But that's going to be more of a long distance band. And it's generally speaking, a daytime band. That's not to say you can't use it at night. You can. Again, it depends on the year and things like, I'm sorry, not the year, the time of year and things like that. But generally speaking, 20 meters is going to be a long distance daytime band with some nighttime use depending on where we are in the seasons. All right. 40 meters, this guy up here, 7 megahertz, that is going to be generally during the day a short range or regional band. So it might be anywhere from across town to across the state. All right. At night, 40 meters opens up to worldwide communications. I have worked New Zealand from my house in New York on 40 meters. That was first thing in the morning before the sun came up. It was like, I don't know, 5 o'clock in the morning. So depending on the time of day, the 40-meter band could be a very long range band or a very short range band. All right. As we go up in frequency, the bands get the distance those bands can transmit generally gets longer and longer. Okay, so when we get up into, let's say, 17 meters, 15 meters, 12 meters, and 10 meters, all right, those bands are going to be better for long distance. So for instance, if I wanted to talk to Europe, 20 meters, 15 meters, 17 meters would work. The band I was just on when I made that Parks of the Air contact was 17 meters. 12 meters works great too. Now, the thing you have to understand is that once we get above, let's say, 15 meters, these bands, 12 meters and 10 meters, they're not always open. You can't always use them. All right. That's going to depend on solar conditions, where we are in the solar cycle. We'll talk about those things in a minute. And what time of day it is. So for instance, if it's nighttime, forget 10 meters and 12 meters and things like that. They're not going to do anything. All right. At night, you're probably going to be 20 meters and below, 20, 30, 40. Now 30 meters, you can't do voice on. It's data and Morse code only. All right. 60 meters is a tricky band we'll talk about in a minute. That's channelized. It's shared with a lot of other entities like the military, for instance. 80 meters is a fantastic nighttime band that is really good for, uh, regional to long distance nighttime. 160 meters can be anything from real close range to real long range, again, depending on what time of day it is, conditions, things like that. So I know this gets complicated and it's a little confusing. Just understand that generally speaking, the lower the frequency, the more regional it's going to be, especially during the day, to the point where once you get much past 60 meters, 80 meters and lower frequency. So when we get to 80, 160, those are generally not usable during the day. 60 meters may be, 40 meters will be, but again, it's probably going to be more regional. It might be within your state or, surrounding counties, things like that. All right. Like I said, 20 meters, that's generally sort of what our bread and butter, what we call DX bands. DX is long distance. So you can use the 20-meter band to talk, like I said, I could use that. You could use that to talk to a couple states over or a couple countries over. And as we go up in frequency, generally speaking, that distance increases. All right. But like I said, as frequency increases, understand that these bands will not always work. 10 meters will not always work. 12 meters will not always work. 15 meters will not always work. All right. So the trick with HF is you're going to see that you really need to know what band to use at what time of day under what conditions. And this is where this gets a little funky, because when we looked at UHF and VHF, 6 meters and higher frequency, those are open all the time, right? Because they're line of sight. It doesn't matter whether it's day, night, solar conditions, none of that stuff make any difference. Once you get up, and now 6 meters, it can. Solar conditions can play with 6 meters, especially aurora. But generally speaking, unless that stuff is going on 6 meters, is going to be a line of sight band. But once you get above 6 meters, that's when things start to get a little more complicated. So understand that the longer the wavelength in number, so 80 meters is a longer wavelength than 20 meters. The longer the wavelength, the lower the frequency. So 20 meters is 14 megahertz, 80 meters is 3.5 megahertz. The lower the frequency, the better that band's going to be at night, and the worse it's going to be during the day. Generally speaking, during the day, the lower the frequency, the shorter the distance that frequency or that signal is going to travel. You may not get out at all. So if I got on 80 meters right now, it is currently 4 p.m., I probably would not be able to do anything on 80 meters. But if I got on 20, there's a contest going on right now, so 20 is packed. There's a single sideband contest, a voice contest. But if I got on 20 meters right now, it's booming. All right. So, like I said, you're going to have to do a little playing with this. This is not the kind of thing that you just go, okay, it's noon and it is whatever. I'm going to hop on this band and it's going to work. It might. Like I said, this takes a lot of trial and error, a lot of finding out what works, what doesn't. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of things like the time of year, the time of day, where we are in the solar cycle, what the solar conditions are like that are going to change all of these things. Okay. So again, just understand we're looking at 28 megahertz up to about down to about 1.8 megahertz. So from 10 meters to 160 meters, those are going to be the HF bands we're going to be talking about. The ones you're going to use the most, like I said, things like 40 meters, 20 meters, 80 meters. Those are going to be the ones you're probably going to be using the most. All right. Now, in order to understand how this travels beyond line of sight, you need to understand the ionosphere. Okay, so this is a document on the ARRL website. All right, it's titled "Radio Waves in the Ionosphere," and it explains how the different layers of the ionosphere are formed, what the different layers are. So the D layer, the E layer, the F1 layer, the F2 layer. All right, how high they are up in the atmosphere, and how those affect radio propagation. All right. So I'm going to try to make this as simple as I can. During the day, the sun is going to ionize the Earth's atmosphere, and it's going to create these layers, the D layer and E layer. All right. During the day, generally speaking, what's going to happen is, especially at higher frequencies, as you transmit, those frequencies, those actual radio transmissions are going to emanate from your antenna. They're going to hit the ionosphere, and they are going to refract down. They bend back down towards the Earth again. All right. Now, during the day, the lower frequencies, so like 40 meters, 80 meters, so like 7 megahertz, 3.5 megahertz, they are absorbed by the D and E layer. So they are attenuated. That's why they don't work real well during the day, because they go up and instead of bouncing back down, they're basically absorbed. The ionosphere kind of acts like a sponge and just dissipates it. And then it dissipates out through the atmosphere into space. It does not refract back down to Earth. Okay. Now, as the sun goes down, that D and E layer, they dissipate. So now we end up with our lower frequencies going up to the F layer. They will refract off the F layer of the atmosphere and back down for tremendously long distance communications. That's why at night you can hear shortwave and AM stations from all over the place, because they're not being absorbed by the ionosphere anymore. They're being refracted off the F layer. And because that layer is so high, that propagation, that refraction back down to Earth is a very long distance. All right. Now, you can also get multiple hops. So you can have the RF emitted from your antenna, hit the ionosphere, bounce off the Earth, back up to the ionosphere, and back down again. So you will get multiple hops. All right. That is how you end up with really, really long distance communication. That's not just going from one antenna to the other. It's going up to the ionosphere, back down to the Earth, bouncing off the Earth, going back up to the ionosphere, coming back down to Earth again. All right. So this is a multi-hop kind of thing. You can also, you end up with what's something called a dead zone or a skip zone. All right. So if I've got one antenna here, and that wave is being bounced up off the ionosphere and back down again, things in between cannot hear that. All right, that's called a skip zone. So if you're in the skip zone, you will not be able to hear the other station. So if you're listening to an HF station, you may only hear one side of the conversation. In fact, it's fairly common. You'll hear one person talking, but not the person they're talking to, because your station, your antenna happens to be in the skip zone of that other station. So you're either too close or too far away where their signal is bouncing over your antenna and you're not hearing them. Again, this is what makes HF so tricky and why it takes so much practice to be able to do this effectively. Like I said, this is not the kind of thing you just pick up and go. That's why this is going to be a multi-part series. I'm going to try to break these things down so they make as much sense as possible without making them overly complicated. I can't dumb it down too much, and I'm not trying to talk down to people. Don't think that that's what I'm trying to do. I just understand. I remember how frustrating this was when I first started learning this stuff, not understanding why sometimes I could hear, let's say, North Carolina, and other times I couldn't, or why, I could hear them no problem in October or November, but I couldn't hear them in May. All right. All of these things are going to play a role in how HF propagation works. So, like I said, during the day, we have these D and E layers right here. These are going to refract your higher frequencies back down to the Earth. At night, those dissipate, and these F layers refract your lower frequencies down to Earth, while the higher frequencies just go right through the F layer and out into space. And that's why the higher frequencies, things like 10 meters and 12 meters and 15 meters, generally don't work at night, because they don't have anything to refract off of. They just go out into the space. All right. So time, like I said, time of day and time of year are going to matter. So if we look at, I'm going to go over to this website. This is called Solar Ham. All right. This is solar conditions for ham radio. And yes, it makes this big of a difference. If we look at where the sun is this time of year, all right, so I'm going to go to this D-layer absorption map. All right, so the sun is right here. We are up here. Okay, so the sun is down below the equator right now, all right, because it is currently, today is October 26, 2024. So it is fall here in the United States. I'm way up here. So when the sun is directly overhead, it generally causes a lot of mayhem with the bands. Propagation isn't really good. As the sun moves away from you, the propagation generally gets a little better. So in the summer, especially during the day when the sun is right overhead, most of the bands don't work real well. All right. You get a lot of absorption. See, this graph over here is showing us what frequencies are being absorbed. All right. So you can see low frequencies, 100% are being absorbed. And as the frequency goes up, less and less of it is being absorbed by the ionosphere. So during the summer, when the sun is up here, our band conditions during the day are worse. During the fall and winter, when the sun moves further and further away from us, as the Earth tilts, because we're on an axis, our angle of insolation towards the sun changes depending on the seasons. So as you get into fall and winter, and the sun isn't directly overhead with that 90 degrees straight down to your location kind of thing, the bands improve. So right now, the bands are fantastic. In the winter, the bands will be fantastic. In the spring, they'll start to get worse again. All right. So time of year and time of day play a huge role in this. So you can see over here, this is Africa and Asia and Europe, and it is currently dark there. Notice we have no absorption. So the colors here represent what the frequencies being absorbed are. So you can see over the poles, everything's being absorbed. All right. Sorry, that keeps refreshing. This refreshes every minute or 2 minutes, I think. But you can see this purple area. That's about, someplace between 7 and 12 megahertz that's being absorbed here. Over here, it's black. All right. Over here, where it's dark out, these real low frequencies will work great because they will go up. There's no D and E layer anymore. They'll go up, they'll hit the F layer, and they will bounce off, they'll refract off, come back down to Earth, and you get long distance propagation on these lower frequencies. All right. So time of day and time of year are going to play a big role in this. So fall, winter, mid to late fall through early spring, band conditions are generally pretty good during the day. Late spring through the summer and into the very early fall, daytime band conditions are not fantastic until you get to nighttime. From like dusk onwards, they're insane. It gets fantastically good. But during the day, it's not amazing. So with that, like I said, we've got all these solar conditions, and I don't want to get too involved in all these solar conditions. All right, but you will see this graph right here. These are solar flares. So when there's a big solar flare, you get a radio blackout. All right, so it will actually blot out any radio transmissions at all. HF will not work at all during one of those, generally speaking. The bigger the flare, the worse that gets. Okay, so you may turn the radio on and the bands are just flat dead. There's a distinct possibility that there's been a flare. They dissipate pretty quickly though. All right, so just understand that also. So once you learn a little bit more about these solar conditions, this is a good website because it shows you all of those solar conditions in one place. Again, I don't want to overwhelm you. Just understand that the sun is going to play a huge role in how well HF radio works. With that, we also need to consider where we are in the solar cycle. So the sun goes in 11-year solar cycles. We're currently in solar cycle 25. As we increase in the solar cycle, our sunspots increase. So as our sunspot numbers go up, HF propagation gets better. As the sunspot numbers go down, especially our higher frequencies, stop to work so well. So at the peak of the solar cycle, your high frequency bands, so things like, let me go back over to our band chart. So things like 15 meters, 12 meters, 10 meters, CB, which is 11 meters, work really well. So I've had a lot of people comment say, forget all that stuff, just get a CB. Here's the thing about CB. At the bottom of a solar cycle, a CB isn't going to work any better than a regular handheld radio is because, again, it's going to be line of sight. Now, at the peak of a solar cycle, yeah, you can get really long distance on 11 meters on CB, but that only happens at the peak of the solar cycle when you have high sunspot numbers. As we start to go down on this solar cycle, our HF conditions will start to deteriorate and the lower bands will start to work better. So you'll lose the ability to use 10 meters and 12 meters and 15 meters and maybe 17 meters. And then the lowest frequency you probably can use is going to be 20 meters. And that's when these lower frequencies really come into shine. 40 meters, 60 meters, 80 meters, 160 meters. That's when those bands are really going to come into play because you don't have the same kind of propagation due to solar conditions. So understand that even the time in the solar cycle affects this stuff. And I know this is weird and this is complicated. Like I said, I'm not trying to overwhelm you. There's just a lot to understand. So where we are in the solar cycle is going to play a role in what bands will work. Right now, we are at the peak of solar cycle 25. The sunspot numbers have been through the roof. Sometimes too much of a good thing is bad. So we end up with conditions where the sun just blots out all of the HF. But generally speaking, as your sunspot numbers start to increase, HF propagation increases. As those start to decrease, as we go along down the downward slope of the 11-year solar cycle and cycle 25, those conditions will deteriorate and those higher bands will start to go away. All right. So there's a lot to understand just when it comes to the sun, time of day, time of year, time in the solar cycle that plays a huge role in how HF propagation works. Now, let's talk a little bit about actual propagation here. So what does propagation mean? So what you're looking at right now is something called the reverse beacon network. So what this will do is this will show me real-time spots of where I am being heard. Now, this is going to work on Morse code. All right. So I just turned my radio on. Hopefully you can hear me sending. This should not. I don't think this will cancel out the background noise. If it does, just understand that I'm about to send what's called a CQ or a call. So I'm looking for calls. I'm not actually going to answer any calls right now, but I'm going to do something called call CQ. And it's going to take about a minute, and you're going to see this map propagate with where I'm being heard. Okay, so this is a great tool. If you want to see where that band is actually getting out, this works fantastic. You don't even need to know Morse code to use this. You can program your HF radio with a CQ call in Morse code and then just hit the memory function and let it send. You don't need to send it yourself. It'll send it out and it will report back. So let me just make sure we got a clear frequency. So I'm doing something called call QRL. QRL means is the frequency in use. All right, I don't hear anybody coming back to me. I got a station right next to me on my waterfall, but we're clear. So I'm going to go ahead and call CQ. So I just sent out a call, and I did hit the reverse beacon network because I got an alert on my phone. So we're going to give this a minute, and you're going to see this map populate with where I am being heard. And this will show you I'm on 20 meters. I'm at 14.069 megahertz at the moment. So when you see this, okay, there you go, boom. So I was being heard over into Europe. I'm being heard into the Midwest. I'm being heard all the way down into Costa Rica. All right, and if we scroll down here, this signal to noise ratio number, these are all pretty high numbers. That's good. When you get down to these single digit ones, so like this one over in England, this MM3NDH, that's probably still audible, assuming band conditions aren't real noisy. But all these signal to noise ratios in the 20s or 38, there's a bunch more. So look at that now. All right, it populated a second time. And look at all those stations. I'm bombing way into Europe. Now, this is on 100 watts on not much of an antenna, not very high in the air. All right, and you can see how far out my signal is getting. Now, that doesn't mean I could work voice on all of those people. We'll talk about different modes and why some modes are more efficient than others in subsequent videos. But right now, on Morse code, all of those places where those purple dot or where those purple lines are going to the red dots, those are all places that heard me when I did that. Okay, and you can see that my signal to noise ratios on pretty much all of these are quite good. So that tells me that the 20 meter band at the moment is in very good shape. So if I was trying to get information out long distance, 20 meters would be a good band to use right now. And you can, it's 4:16 p.m. on October 26, 2024. Okay, so it's fall, so the bands are in good shape. It's early afternoon, so 20 meters is still in good shape. And currently, we don't have any crazy solar flares. We had a huge one earlier. You can see it right here. We had one the other day, great big one. Another one earlier. All right, but currently we don't have any solar flares. So I am being heard all over the place. All right. Now, the next one, I'm actually not going to do this right now because this takes a couple of minutes. Maybe I'll shoot another short video on how to use Whisper. But Whisper is the weak signal propagation reporting system. or WSPR. And whisper uses very low power, and it transmits for several minutes, and it will show you a map where you're being heard, and you will be heard all over the planet with whisper. All right. So I don't know if I can do, let's try this. Let's try me. Search. That's because I haven't been on here in quite a while. So like I said, I'll shoot a second video on how to use whisper to see what propagation is like. You need separate software on your computer to be able to do this. This is a little bit more complicated to set up, but whisper is a good tool to see what propagation is like as well. All right. Another thing you can, and I'll put links to all these things in the video description. Another thing you can look at is this map. This is hfdxview.org. So let me pause this for just a second. So what you're looking at right now is, let me zoom in. So that star is me. That's where I am. All right. We are currently looking at the 10 meter band or 28 megahertz. All right. So if I hover over these, this is CW. This is single sideband. So this would be voice. This bubble here would be Morse code. This bubble here is digital. Okay. So if I click play, that's 6 meters, which is basically useless right now. This is our maximum usable frequency, which is 28 megahertz. That's 80 meters. And again, you can see there's nothing on 80 meters we can use. 80 meters is dead right now. It's the middle of the day. That's 60 meters, again, of limited usefulness. There's 40 meters. Now notice that we're not going very far here. However, I can theoretically get over into Europe on 40 meters right now. I doubt I could try it, but here's 30 meters. Here's 20 meters, which we were just on. And as you can see, that's bombing all over Europe. And you saw my reverse beacon net spots look eerily similar. So if you look at where we were landing in Europe and you look where we were landing in the US and we go back over to this map, there's where I could probably be heard in Europe on CW, and that's where I was being heard, or Morse code. And over here in the US, that's where I would be heard. Here's 17 meters. So this is the band that I just worked that station in Wisconsin on. And what do you know? So he was right over here. So he's just outside where it shows single sideband being able to work. He was a little weak, but it worked. Here's 15 meters. So again, you can see now we're getting a lot further away from me. You can see the purple is much, much further out than it was on, let's say, 20 meters. So if I go back to 20 meters, you can see that's closer. Now we get out to 15 meters, it's getting further away. Here's 12 meters. Now 12 meters is short right now, which is interesting. 10 meters, all right. And then what's called the maximum usable frequency. We're going to talk about that in just a second. All right, so this map is really good for showing you roughly where you're going to be heard on what mode on each band. You can click on the map to pick your location. We'll talk about how you figure out your location in a minute because it's going to want what's called a Maidenhead designator. This map, this is the maximum usable frequency. Okay, so this is what frequency is the maximum frequency you can use and have it refract off the ionosphere. So if you look at this map, let me zoom in. So above me, I'm right where that cursor is. It's about 35 megahertz, which is quite high. That's above 10 meters. That's good. Look over here where it's nighttime. Look in Europe. So if I zoom in on Europe, look at how much lower, 13 megahertz, 15 megahertz. Okay, so the sun is down here. It's nighttime. All right, so our maximum frequency we can use and have it refract off the ionosphere is low. So right here where it says 13 megahertz, I could not use 20 meters because 20 meters is 14 megahertz. All right, I could just use 20 meters and maybe 18 meters in these places. All right, so this shows you what the maximum frequency you could use to get out is. The opposite of that is, what is the minimum frequency you can use and have ionospheric propagation? In other words, what's the minimum frequency you can use to get ionospheric refraction. So where I am, it's about 12 megahertz. So not much lower than the 20 meter band where I'm currently on. If you look over in Europe, where it's nighttime, 5 megahertz, 6 megahertz, 7 megahertz, all right, much lower because that D layer of the ionosphere is gone. So now those low frequencies will refract off the F layer of the ionosphere. Okay, so this is a great map for that kind of stuff, trying to find out roughly what's the highest and lowest frequencies I can use to make a contact. Now, if you want even more granular, this is called VOACAP. Okay, this is from Voice of America. This is designed specifically for ham radio. So what you do is up on top, you set your grid location. So if you don't know what a grid my grid is FN12XC. Okay, so if I go into, you just search for a Maidenhead grid square locator map, you can enter your zip code in here. So let's suppose, so there's mine. So 13760, click submit. And it tells me that I would be in FN12XD. I'm actually not, I'm in XC. I'm on the very edge of that zip code. It wouldn't matter that much. All right. So what I've got here is, so I've got a pin down here. This is where my buddy Aaron, W4ARB, lives. And I am up here in the southern tier of New York. So over here on the right-hand side, I've got drop downs. So I can pick the mode I want to use. So Whisper, we talked about that before. FT8 and FT4 are digital modes. CW is Morse code. SSB is single sideband. That's voice. That's what I just did at the beginning of this video. And AM is exactly what it sounds like. So let's suppose I wanted to see voice, single sideband. I'm on a 100-watt radio. All right. And my antenna, so we're going to, let's say 20 meters. Let's say 20 meters. I am on, let's see. Find the closest thing to what I'm on. I'm on roughly, I'm not really on a dipole. I'm more on like a random wire, but this does not have the ability to do that. So let's say I'm on a 20-meter dipole. And let's say Aaron is also, I know he's not, but let's say he was also on a 20-meter dipole. All right. If I click propagation charts, right? No, sorry, propagation wheel. So I click propagation wheel. This will show me what band and what time of day will give me the highest probability to make that contact. So 100-watt, single sideband on a 20-meter dipole, all right? So if we look, right now it is currently, what time is it, UTC 20? So it'll be 2000 hours. So right now, if I come up here to 20, I could use 15 meters, 17 meters, or 20 meters. And if you look in the center of the circle, on 50 meters, I'd have a 96% chance to make that contact, a 97% chance on 20 meters, and a 96% chance on 17 meters, and a 96% chance on 20 meters, all right? If I go up, so like if we go to 10 meters, it's only a 53% chance. If I come down to 40 meters, it's only a 40 meters is a 55% chance. 60 and 80, 0. They're not going to work at all. Now, if you look at night, now, if we look when the sun's down, now 40 meters, all right, so like that'd be like midnight, 88% chance, all right? So again, it depends on the time of day. And you can move your time of day around on this slider. So if you want to see what happens if I wanted to do this later, I can move this and move the sun, all right, and we can see roughly how that's going to affect our propagation. This propagation chart is pretty cool because I can move this anywhere on the map. So if I want to do, let's say I wanted to talk to Amarillo, Texas. So let's plop this on Amarillo, Texas. Now you'll see a green line from me to Amarillo. You also see this red dotted line. That's what's called the long path. That's going all the way around the earth. Sometimes that's the way you're actually going to communicate. So if I wanted to talk to Amarillo, Texas right now on 20 meters, my best chances would be 10 meters and 12 meters. I've got a 91% chance on the 10 meter band and a 90% chance on the 12 meter band. And 15 and 17, I'm in the mid 80s. And if I get up to 20, I'm back up to 85 again. And once I get below 20 meters, the chances of that happening are slim to none. If I wanted to, let's say I wanted to talk to England, plop that over there. Now you can see my chances just greatly deteriorated. Now on 20 meters, my best chance, at 20 meters would be my best chance. That's only a 67% probability I'm going to make that contact. Now, if I change to a different mode, let's go to Morse code. Watch this. Boom. Look at how much better the propagation is on Morse code. We'll talk about why that is when we talk about the different modes. But right now on 20 meters, I'd have a 92% chance of making that same contact. All right, so mode is going to play a huge difference in how well you get out. All right, so VOACAP is a fantastic tool for trying to predict how well you're going to get out. And this calculates it based on your date and time. So you can come down here and tell it what day you want to do this on. Because remember, the time of year changes this stuff. So you can tell it what date you want and what time of the day you want, and it will tell you what band you should probably be on to make that contact. So it's a really cool tool. So if I wanted to say let's say I wanted to make the same contact in, let's say, July of 25. Let's say I wanted to do the 4th of July, 2025 to England. All right. You can see my probabilities are very low because, again, remember, my propagation gets worse during the summer. So let's move it to later in the day here. Not making much difference. So you can see I don't have a whole heck of a lot of chances here. 20 meters is probably going to be my best bet. All right. And even then it's going to be it's like 70% chance. All right. So VOACAP is a really cool tool for trying to predict when you can make a contact. But at the end of the day, like I said, there's a lot that goes into trying to make one of these HF contacts, right? You need to know what band do I need to be on, at what time of the day, what time of the year, right? You need to understand how these different ionospheric layers affect the refraction of your high frequency radio waves. You need to understand how solar conditions affect the ionosphere. We need to know where we are in the solar cycle to know should we be on higher frequency bands or lower frequency bands. We've got tools we can use to check our propagation, things like the reverse beacon network. Just for giggles, let me hop over to the 40 meter band. So I'm going to do the same exact thing, but I'm going to do it on 40 meters. Okay, so I'll show you what 20 meters looked like again. So let me go back. Let me put this to 20 minutes. So that's what 20 meters looked like. So let's do the same thing on 40 meters. See if I even hit the reverse beacon network here. Yep, I did. Okay, so it's going to take about a minute for this to fill in. While it is, I'll just continue talking. So like I said, we've got ways to check our propagation. We've got the reverse beacon network, which we'll come back to in a second. You'll see what 40 looks like. We've got Whisper. Like I said, I'll shoot another short video on Whisper in and of itself because it's a little more complicated. We've got maps like our HFDX view map, which shows us our different frequency probabilities and our modes. We've got our maximum usable frequency map, which tells me what the maximum frequency I can use to make a contact is. We've got our minimum frequency or our lowest usable frequency to get ionospheric propagation. And then we've got tools like VOACAP to give us predictions into the future, either in real time, we can do it right this second, or into the future to see if I needed to make, in 4 weeks, if I needed to make targeted contact between myself and someone else, what band should I probably be on at that time of day? Now, again, remember, those aren't absolutes, but that's going to give you a place to start. Okay, so if we look at the reverse beacon network now, this is what 40 meters looks like. So we're getting over to Chicago, up to Albany, over into Ohio, down into, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. So you can see how much shorter that is. Now, if I did the same thing at 10 p.m., it would be over into Europe. It might get down into South America, all sorts of stuff. Okay. So like I said, there's a lot to understand when it comes to high frequency. Just understand that a lot of this is going to take experience. This is not the kind of thing, you don't just pick up an HF radio and go. This takes a lot of playing, a lot of practice to see what works when. All right. So that in an emergency, if something happens and you need to get a message out and because a lot of times you can't reach somebody on a VHF or VHF or UHF radio. If there's nobody in line of sight, you're sunk. If you've got an HF radio, you spin the dial till you hear somebody talking and just say break, 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 and break into their conversation and pass your traffic. Hey, I'm stuck. My car broke down. I'm in the middle of nowhere. It's freezing cold. Here's where I am. Send help, right? You can do that on HF radio. You can't do that on VHF or UHF, all right? The cool thing, like I said, about HF is you need no infrastructure. You need no repeaters. You need no satellites. You need no internet. You need nothing. You need a radio on each end and an antenna on each end, and that is it. All right, folks. So the next video we'll do are on radios themselves. We'll talk about some considerations you might want to think about when you purchase an HF radio. Then we'll talk about power, because powering these things is important. So what are the different aspects of powering these radios? Some of the different considerations for that kind of stuff. And then finally, we'll get into antennas, because antennas, just like on the handhelds, are crucially important, and they are much, much more complicated on HF. So everybody, I really appreciate you watching. Hopefully this helped somewhat. I apologize if it was confusing. I'm trying to make this as simple as possible without missing things. I will put links to all of these things in the video description. I will also put a link to the document that I'm working from. So that document, I'll put it up on the screen here real quick. That document is this. Okay, so it shows all the different things I'm going to talk about, as well as some links to the things I was just in today. All right, so hopefully that helped a little bit. Hopefully it wasn't super confusing. If you have any questions, feel free to leave comments below and I will do my best to answer them. If I can't answer them, I will find a resource where you can go to find more information. But like I said, at the end of the day, when it comes to this HF radio stuff, it's really going to boil down to experience. You're going to have to play with it. You're going to see what works and see what doesn't. It's much more complicated than just simply picking up a radio, keying up, and talking. All right, everybody. So thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I appreciate all the support I've gotten on all of these radio for preparedness videos. I never intended to shoot these series, but people have been so interested in it and so supportive of this series that I'm going to continue. I do have a couple more things that I'll do in the UHF, VHF spectrum as well. I'll probably put another video out midweek on just some simple stuff. But like I said, we're going to go through several videos on high frequency radio. So thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And as always, until next time, 7-3.